A prejudiced pilot had no idea what consequences awaited him when he dismissed Morgan Freeman from a flight. The outcome was one he wouldn't soon forget. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Morgan Freeman strolled into the bustling airport, the sliding glass doors parting as he entered. The terminal was alive with the rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases, the murmur of travelers, and occasional announcements cutting through the air. Overhead, bright fluorescent lights cast a cool, sterile glow on the expansive space, reflecting off polished tiles and gleaming railings. Despite the lively scene, families sharing hugs, business people glued to their devices, and staff briskly guiding passengers through security, Morgan's entrance was largely unnoticed. Dressed simply in a well-worn denim jacket, a plain button-down shirt, and a pair of scuffed leather shoes that bore the evidence of countless miles, Morgan carried an unassuming air. His weathered brown backpack, its straps softened by time, hung off one shoulder. His face, familiar to millions around the globe, carried the gentle imprints of wisdom and age, but on this particular day, his features were etched with fatigue. Weeks of intense filming had drained him, leaving him longing for nothing more than a quiet flight, where the drone of the engines could lull him to sleep. Approaching the check-in counters for first-class passengers, Morgan's stride was calm but resolute. As he moved closer, he felt the weight of wandering gazes. A sharply dressed man, adjusting his cufflinks, shot a brief glance his way before leaning toward his companion to whisper. Nearby, a woman in pearls instinctively tightened her grip on her purse as Morgan passed. Undeterred, Morgan maintained his serene expression and walked on. Reaching the counter, he placed his passport and ticket on the smooth surface. The young attendant behind the desk, with her hair neatly pinned and her uniform impeccably pressed, greeted him with a practiced, professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good afternoon, sir. May I have your ticket, please?" Morgan offered a small nod and slid the ticket closer. "Of course." She scanned the document briefly before glancing at him. Though her smile remained fixed, a flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, flashed in her eyes. "First class?" she asked, as if seeking confirmation. "That's correct," Morgan replied with his characteristic calm. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she verified the information, the hesitation in her movements just noticeable enough to draw his attention. She glanced at the screen, then back at him. "May I also see your ID, sir?" Without a word, Morgan retrieved his passport from his jacket and slid it across the counter. The attendant accepted it, her lips pressing into a thin line. As she examined the document, she leaned toward a colleague nearby, murmuring words like "double-check" and "verify the booking." Morgan stood patiently, accustomed to delays, but something about the prolonged whispers and sidelong glances gnawed at him. It wasn't just the delay, it was the unease that had begun to creep in, a sense that he was being scrutinized more than necessary. After a few moments, the attendant returned his documents with an apologetic but noticeably strained smile. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Freeman. Everything seems to be in order." "Seems to be?" Morgan asked, raising a brow. She straightened, her expression unwavering. "Apologies for the inconvenience. It was just a routine check." Morgan gave a curt nod, accepting her explanation despite the hollow ring of her words. Collecting his passport and ticket, he headed toward the security checkpoint, where the scrutiny only deepened. At the TSA line, he was singled out for an additional screening. His backpack was unzipped, each compartment thoroughly searched, while he stood with arms outstretched for a pat-down. Meanwhile, other passengers breezed through with little more than a glance. "Sir, this is just a standard procedure," the agent said, though the sharpness in his tone lacked any semblance of courtesy. Morgan remained composed, suppressing a sigh as the wand swept over his body. Predictably, the search yielded nothing, but the encounter left a residual tension in its wake. He gathered his belongings and moved toward the gate, hoping for some reprieve. Even the first-class lounge, designed as a haven for weary travelers, failed to provide the solace Morgan sought. The polished decor, plush seating, and aroma of freshly brewed coffee did little to mask the palpable tension that followed him inside. Conversations faltered as he entered, and glances darted in his direction. An older couple near the coffee bar whispered conspiratorially, their eyes flickering toward him before quickly averting. A businessman, sharply dressed in a designer suit, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, pulling his briefcase closer as though Morgan's presence posed a threat. Morgan settled into a chair, placing his backpack beside him, and attempted to relax, but the weight of the stairs bore down on him, punctuated by a muttered remark just loud enough to hear. "This place isn't what it used to be." He tightened his grip on the armrest, inhaling deeply to steady himself. He had faced such moments countless times before, but the familiarity didn't make them any easier. When the boarding announcement finally came, Morgan rose, gathered his belongings, and made his way to the gate. The first-class boarding line was short, but as he approached, the uneasy atmosphere lingered. "Sir?" Morgan turned to face the gate agent, a young man with slicked-back hair who eyed him skeptically before glancing at his ticket. "First class is boarding now. Economy is over there," the agent said, gesturing dismissively. Holding up his ticket, Morgan responded evenly, "I'm in first class." The agent took the ticket, inspecting it with narrowed eyes. "One moment," he said, before walking away to consult a colleague. As the minutes dragged on, murmurs spread through the growing line behind Morgan. A frustrated voice piped up, "Can we hurry this up already?" Morgan stood silently, his hands resting on his backpack's strap, as the scrutiny continued. When the agent finally returned, his forced smile betrayed his unease. "Everything checks out. You may proceed." Morgan nodded, stepping forward with quiet dignity, but the experience lingered like an unwelcome shadow. Morgan Freeman accepted his ticket back and stepped through the gate, feeling the weight of judgmental stares following him like silent echoes. As he entered the jet bridge, the tension in his chest only tightened, a prelude to what he suspected would be the true test of his patience. Each step brought him closer to the inevitable confrontation he had begun to anticipate. The first-class cabin greeted him with its understated elegance, plush leather seats that folded into beds, polished wooden panels, and warm, golden lighting that bathed the area in a soft glow. The faint scent of leather mixed with a hint of champagne, adding to the cabin's air of exclusivity. But this aura of luxury offered little solace to Morgan, who immediately sensed an invisible wall of discomfort. Near the front row, a woman wrapped in an ivory shawl, adorned with glittering diamond earrings, turned her head sharply to examine him. Her gaze lingered before she subtly shifted in her seat, her hands clutching a designer purse more tightly. Just behind her, a man impeccably dressed in a tailored suit leaned toward his companion, murmuring something. The woman glanced Morgan's way, smirking slightly as her eyes swept over him. Morgan's grip on his bag's strap tightened, but he pressed forward, refusing to let the unspoken disdain faze him. He located his seat, 3A, and placed his bag in the overhead compartment, careful and deliberate. Settling into the wide leather seat, he let out a breath, trying to dismiss the murmurs that seemed to drift through the air like smoke. "He's probably using someone else's ticket," came a hushed voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for Morgan to hear. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the negativity around him, focusing instead on the low hum of the engines. However, his reprieve was short-lived. A steward dressed sharply in a navy blue uniform approached, clipboard in hand. His polished shoes barely made a sound on the carpet as he stopped beside Morgan's seat. "Excuse me, sir," the steward began, his tone polite but tinged with cold authority. "We seem to have a small issue with your seating assignment." Morgan opened his eyes and straightened in his seat, his expression calm but wary. "An issue?" The steward nodded, extending a hand. "May I see your ticket, please?" Morgan hesitated for a moment before retrieving the ticket from his pocket and handing it over. The steward examined it with meticulous care, his gaze flicking back and forth between the document and Morgan. "This is a first-class ticket, correct?" the steward asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Yes, it is," Morgan replied, his tone firm. The steward's eyes darted toward the front of the cabin, where a few passengers, including the woman in the ivory shawl, had stopped pretending to look elsewhere. Her stare was unwavering, her lips pressed into a thin line. "One moment," the steward said curtly, before turning on his heel and walking briskly toward the front of the plane. Morgan exhaled slowly, leaning back into his seat. He could feel the collective weight of the passengers' stares pressing down on him. Whispers rippled through the cabin, conversations becoming harder to ignore. When the steward returned, he wasn't alone. Following behind him was the captain, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose piercing blue eyes carried an air of authority. His crisp uniform, adorned with gold stripes and rank insignias, only added to his commanding presence. The captain stopped in front of Morgan's seat, his posture rigid. "Sir," he began, his voice steady but firm, "I'm Captain Brooks. We need to have a word with you." Morgan remained seated, his hands resting on the armrests. "Is there a problem?" The captain's gaze didn't waver. Instead, he gestured toward the aisle. "I'd prefer to discuss this privately. Please, come with me." Morgan's expression hardened. "If there's an issue, you can address it here." The captain's jaw tightened. "I'm asking you politely, sir." "And I'm asking you," Morgan said, his voice calm but resolute. "What exactly is the issue?" The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers were no longer subtle in their curiosity, and several phones had appeared, their cameras discreetly aimed at the unfolding scene. The captain's tone shifted, becoming sharper. "Your presence here has raised concerns. We need to confirm your identity and verify your ticket. If you refuse to cooperate, we'll have no choice but to involve security." Morgan's pulse quickened, but he kept his composure. "I've already shown my ticket and ID. Twice. If you need to verify them again, do it here. I'm not leaving my seat." The captain's eyes narrowed, his frustration visible. "Stand up," he ordered, his voice louder now, drawing even more attention. "No," Morgan replied, leaning back into his seat. The word hung heavy in the air. A simple refusal weighted with defiance. The captain turned to the steward. "Get security." The whispers erupted into a low hum of chatter, punctuated by fragments of conversations that reached Morgan's ears. "Why doesn't he just go?" one voice asked. "This is why you can't let certain people in first class," said another. Moments later, the steward returned with two uniformed security officers. The younger of the two, with a shaved head and a stony expression, stepped forward. "Sir, we need you to come with us," he said, his voice flat but commanding. Morgan shook his head. "I've done nothing wrong. I have a ticket. I have a passport. I'm not going anywhere." The officer's tone turned sharp. "You're disturbing the peace and causing alarm among other passengers. If you don't leave voluntarily, we'll remove you by force." Morgan's gaze swept the cabin, catching the dozens of eyes fixed on him. Phones remained trained on the scene, capturing every second. He inhaled deeply before responding. "Disturbing the peace? By sitting in my assigned seat?" The younger officer reached into the overhead compartment, retrieving Morgan's bag and dropping it at his feet. "Let's go," he ordered curtly. Morgan stood slowly, his tall frame towering over the officer. He raised his hands, his movements deliberate and calm. "This is how you treat your passengers?" he asked, his voice low but resolute. "Passengers who follow the rules don't have problems," the officer retorted, his tone cutting. Morgan's eyes scanned the cabin, lingering on the faces around him, some curious, others amused, and a few openly hostile. The sting of the moment was undeniable, but he refused to let it break him. Morgan Freeman silently picked up his bag, his face composed despite the storm raging within, and allowed the security officers to guide him down the aisle. The murmurs from passengers cut like a blade, whispers of "should have known better," chasing him as he walked. Each step felt heavier, the humiliation wrapping around him like an oppressive cloak. He stepped off the plane, the door to the jet bridge sealing behind him with a hollow finality. The sting of disgrace lingered, but Morgan's resolve hardened. He knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Emerging from the jet bridge, Morgan entered the terminal. The cacophony of voices, rolling suitcase wheels, and echoing announcements filled the air. Yet, to him, it all seemed muted. The humiliation of being marched through the airport like a criminal was an unbearable weight, compounded by the stares of onlookers at nearby gates. Some whispered amongst themselves, while others brazenly raised their phones to capture the moment. Morgan's gaze remained fixed ahead, his face a mask of calm. Years in the public eye had taught him the value of composure, especially in moments of adversity. Yet, the bitterness was palpable, simmering beneath the surface. Behind him, the younger officer, the one who had brusquely yanked his bag earlier, walked with an air of authority, his shoulders squared. The older officer trailed silently, his eyes scanning the area as though expecting Morgan to make a sudden move. Stopping by a row of cold, metallic benches, the younger officer gestured dismissively. "Sit," he ordered, his tone clipped. Morgan, standing tall, replied evenly, "I'm fine right here." The officer's jaw tightened. "I said, sit down." Morgan locked eyes with the officer, his voice calm but piercing. "Is this how you treat every passenger? Or just the ones who look like me?" The younger officer's eyes flashed, and he stepped forward aggressively. "What did you just say?" Morgan held his ground, his expression unwavering. "You heard me." For a tense moment, it seemed the officer might lash out, but the older one intervened, placing a firm hand on his partner's arm. "That's enough," he said firmly before turning to Morgan. "Sir, we just need to verify your identity and investigate the situation. Cooperate, and this will be over quickly." After a pause, Morgan slowly lowered himself onto the bench, his posture composed but unyielding. The older officer sat across from him, pulling out a tablet, while the younger one loomed nearby, arms crossed and exuding hostility. "Name?" the older officer asked, though he held Morgan's ID in his hand. Morgan tilted his head, a flicker of disdain crossing his features. "You already know my name. We need you to confirm it," the officer pressed. Morgan sighed, his voice steady. "Morgan Freeman." The questioning continued, mundane and repetitive. Destination? Purpose of travel? Each question felt like an unnecessary insult, but Morgan answered with measured patience, though his irritation was mounting. Finally, the older officer set the tablet down and leaned back. "Everything checks out," he said. The younger officer scoffed, his contempt palpable. "Doesn't mean he belongs in first class." Morgan's eyes narrowed, locking on the officer. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," the officer sneered, stepping closer. His voice dropped, laced with venom. "Men like you don't belong there. You think a fancy ticket changes who you are?" Morgan's fists clenched, his body tense, but he remained seated, his voice low and deliberate. "And what exactly am I?" The officer smirked, leaning slightly closer. "You tell me." Before Morgan could respond, the older officer shot to his feet. "That's enough," he barked, glaring at his partner before turning back to Morgan. "You're free to go." Morgan stood slowly, towering over the younger officer. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of defiance. "I may be free, but this isn't over." The older officer shifted uncomfortably. "I'd advise you to let it go, sir." Morgan gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Let it go? Not this time." Grabbing his bag, he walked away, his back straight despite the heaviness in his chest. The terminal's glass doors slid open, revealing the crisp night air outside. Raindrops glistened on the pavement under the dim glow of streetlights. Morgan stopped under the awning, his breath visible in the chill as he pulled out his phone. Scrolling through his contacts, his thumb hovered over his assistant's name. He hesitated. Going public would ignite a media firestorm, but staying silent would allow injustice to fester. A taxi rolled up nearby, its headlights cutting through the mist, but Morgan ignored it, scrolling further until he landed on the name he needed, his lawyer. The line rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Morgan, it's late." Morgan's voice was firm, resolute. "I need you to look into something for me. The airline I was just kicked off. Find out who owns it, and do it fast." There was a brief pause. "What happened?" "I'll explain later. Just get me the information," Morgan replied, ending the call. The cold air bit at his skin as he stood motionless for a moment, his anger simmering. But beneath the frustration, something stronger took root: determination. By morning, the story had erupted across news outlets and social media. Headlines blared, "Morgan Freeman ejected from first class. Racial profiling or misunderstanding." Video clips recorded by fellow passengers went viral, sparking outrage. The footage of security officers handling Morgan aggressively, paired with the murmurs of judgmental passengers, fueled heated debates on race, privilege, and accountability. Morgan watched the coverage unfold from his hotel room, a mix of frustration and vindication brewing within him. He hadn't sought to weaponize his fame, but the visibility brought by his name offered a platform to confront a system that allowed such injustices to persist. His phone buzzed, breaking his focus. It was his lawyer. "I've got the information," she said. "The airline is owned by a parent company called Horizon Airways, privately held, but they're already under pressure from the backlash. They're scrambling to release a statement." Morgan walked to the window, gazing out at the sprawling city below. "Good," he said, his voice steady. "Let them scramble. I want a meeting with their executives today." His lawyer hesitated. "Are you sure? You could let this blow over." Morgan's response was unwavering. "I'm not letting this blow over. Not this time." Hours later, Morgan found himself in a sleek, glass-walled conference room, seated across from Horizon Airways' top executives. Morgan Freeman sat across from a table of visibly uncomfortable executives. Their fidgeting and darting glances betrayed their unease under his steady, composed gaze. One of them finally cleared his throat and began, "Mr. Freeman, we deeply regret the incident and are prepared to offer compensation for your trouble." Morgan raised a hand, silencing the man mid-sentence. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that filled the room. "This isn't about compensation," he said, his tone resolute. "This is about accountability. You have a systemic problem, and we're going to address it." The silence in the room was deafening. The executives exchanged nervous glances, the weight of Morgan's words sinking in. Morgan leaned forward, resting his hands on the polished table. "Here's what's going to happen," he began. "You will implement mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all your staff, pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, everyone. Additionally, you'll establish a program for passengers to report discrimination directly. No more hiding behind excuses or bureaucracy." One of the executives, emboldened perhaps by the collective silence, asked cautiously, "And if we don't?" Morgan's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "Then you'll hear from my lawyer and the court of public opinion by the end of the day," he said, his voice steady yet sharp as steel. By evening, the airline had issued a public apology, promising a comprehensive review of its policies and immediate changes. But for Morgan, an apology was just the beginning. He knew that real change required persistence and action. As he exited the conference room, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Another call, this time from a journalist. Morgan ignored it, his focus unwavering. The real work was just beginning. The next day, Morgan stood in front of a packed press room. Cameras clicked incessantly, flashes illuminating his face as reporters jostled for the best angles. The energy in the room was palpable. Journalists murmured, adjusted microphones, and shuffled papers, preparing to cover what had already become a global story. Morgan gripped the edges of the podium, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. Behind him stood his lawyer, public relations manager, and representatives from civil rights organizations. A silent yet powerful statement of solidarity. Taking a deep breath, he leaned toward the microphone. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady and deliberate. "I didn't expect to be standing here today, and frankly, I didn't want to be. But after what happened to me 2 days ago, I don't have the luxury of staying silent." The room fell silent, the murmurs ceasing as all attention focused on him. Morgan continued, his voice carrying the weight of his frustration and determination. "As many of you know, I was removed from a first-class seat on a Horizon Airways flight without cause. I showed my ticket. I showed my ID. I followed every rule. And yet, I was treated as though I didn't belong." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. A few reporters nodded, while others furiously scribbled in their notebooks. "I was accused, questioned, humiliated, and threatened, not because I was disruptive or did anything wrong, but because of how I looked." The tension in the room was palpable. Morgan raised a hand to quiet the murmurs before they could begin. "Let's not sugarcoat this," he said firmly. "What I experienced was racial profiling, plain and simple. And let me be clear, this isn't just about me. I'm fortunate. I have a platform, resources, and an audience. But what about the countless others who don't? The travelers who face humiliation, who are denied service or kicked off flights, and who have no cameras rolling to hold anyone accountable. Morgan's voice grew stronger, resonating with the room. That's why I'm here today, not to ask for an apology, because words are cheap. I'm here to demand change. Gasps rippled through the room as flashes from cameras captured his determined expression. Morgan outlined his plan, each point precise and actionable. Effective immediately, I'm launching a foundation dedicated to fighting racial profiling and discrimination in air travel. The Freeman Foundation for Equal Access will ensure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. This foundation will fund legal representation for victims of discrimination and provide comprehensive diversity and sensitivity training for airline staff, from check-in agents to pilots and security officers. He stepped back from the microphone for a moment, scanning the room. But that's not all, he continued, his voice rising with conviction. We're also creating an online platform where passengers can share their experiences and file complaints about discrimination. These stories won't be buried in customer service inboxes. They'll be public. Airlines will answer to the people they serve or lose their business. The room erupted into applause. Morgan didn't smile. His face remained resolute. He leaned into the microphone one last time. This isn't just a fight for fairness. It's a fight for dignity, a fight against a culture that tolerates prejudice. And I promise you this, I will not back down until that culture changes. The speech dominated headlines within hours. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Not Flying While Black" and "Fired Freeman Fights." News outlets dissected his every word, debating the implications of his demands. However, the backlash was swift. On morning talk shows, commentators accused Morgan of playing the race card, while others dismissed his claims as an overreaction. This was an isolated incident, one guest insisted. Airlines have policies for a reason. Suspicious behavior warrants scrutiny, regardless of who you are. Morgan watched the coverage with a mix of frustration and weariness. He had expected resistance, but witnessing it unfold in real time was disheartening. Later that evening, his lawyer called with an update. Horizon Airways just released their statement, she said. And? Morgan asked, his tone sharp. They're apologizing, sort of. They called it a misunderstanding and promised to review their policies. But they're already pushing back against your foundation, calling it a publicity stunt. Morgan's lips pressed into a thin line. A publicity stunt? He repeated, his voice cold. They're worried about lawsuits, and they should be. His lawyer hesitated. What's the next move? Set up meetings with regulators and civil rights groups, Morgan said, his resolve unshaken. I want this on the FAA's radar. Morgan Freeman woke to a barrage of notifications, his name plastered across headlines and gossip blogs. The smear campaign was in full force. Old controversies dragged from the shadows, anonymous sources questioning his character. One inflammatory headline read, "Who does Freeman think he is? Arrogant star sparks travel chaos." Tossing his phone onto the bed, Morgan let out a weary sigh. It was a tactic he had seen before. Discredit the messenger to detract from the message. But he had come too far to be derailed now. Later that day, he checked his voicemail and found a message from an unfamiliar number. A woman's voice, trembling but firm, began, "Mr. Freeman, my husband and I were denied entry to a first-class lounge last year. They said we didn't belong, and we didn't argue. We just left. But watching you speak out gave us hope. Thank you." Morgan replayed the message twice, each word rekindling his resolve. Picking up his phone, he called his team. "Let's keep going," he said simply, the determination clear in his tone. By the end of the week, the ripple effects of Morgan's stand were undeniable. Competing airlines announced the expansion of diversity training programs and unveiled new protocols for handling security and passenger concerns. Meanwhile, Morgan's foundation, the Freeman Foundation for Equal Access, raised millions in donations within days. Thousands of passengers shared their stories on the online platform, exposing systemic issues that had long been ignored. Yet, Morgan didn't celebrate. Not yet. In the privacy of his hotel room, He sifted through images from protests staged outside airport terminals. People held signs reading, "Fly fair," and "Equality at 30,000 feet." For the first time in days, he allowed himself a faint smile. The battle wasn't over, but the first victory had been secured. 3 months later, Morgan walked into the bustling terminal of a different airport, his footsteps echoing faintly against the polished tiles. The environment looked the same: gleaming counters, the smell of coffee, and the faint crackle of announcements, but Morgan immediately sensed a change in the air. Approaching the check-in counter, he caught the young agent behind the desk freeze briefly, recognition flickering across his face. Recovering quickly, the man straightened. "Good afternoon, Mr. Freeman," he said, his voice carrying a nervous edge. "It's an honor to have you flying with us today." Morgan raised an eyebrow, but offered a polite nod. "Thank you." The agent's hands moved swiftly over the keyboard. Within seconds, he returned Morgan's ticket, his demeanor professional yet noticeably cautious. "I see you're in first class. If you'd like, I can have someone escort you to the lounge." Morgan gave a faint smile. "I think I can manage on my own, but thank you." The agent nodded, stepping aside to gesture toward the priority lane. As Morgan passed, he noticed the agent exhale sharply, the tension visibly leaving his shoulders. In the first-class lounge, the changes were even more apparent. Gone were the guarded glances and whispered judgments. Instead, Morgan was greeted by a smiling hostess, who guided him to a quiet corner overlooking the runway. "Let me know if you need anything," she said warmly, before stepping away. Morgan sat down, scanning the room. The atmosphere was notably more relaxed, the clientele a diverse mix of ages, races, and styles. While part of him wondered if the change was merely a performance, a PR-driven overcorrection, he chose to see it as progress, no matter how tentative. When boarding was announced, Morgan moved through the gate without incident. The agent at the door checked his ticket with a smile and gestured him aboard. No questions, no scrutiny. As Morgan entered the first-class cabin, he braced himself for the usual glances, but this time the stares felt more curious than hostile. He placed his bag in the overhead compartment and settled into his seat. The leather was as plush as ever, but the weight of judgment that had followed him in the past was noticeably absent. "Mr. Freeman, welcome aboard," a flight attendant said brightly, appearing almost instantly. "Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" Morgan hesitated, studying her expression for a moment. Was her warmth genuine or rehearsed? "Just water for now," he replied. She nodded and disappeared down the aisle. The woman seated next to him turned slightly and smiled. "I saw your speech," she said softly. Morgan glanced at her. She appeared to be in her early 40s, dressed in a tailored business suit, her hair neatly pinned back. "I just wanted to say thank you," she continued. "I travel a lot for work, and I've seen things like that happen more times than I can count. It's about time someone spoke up." Morgan felt a flicker of warmth at her words. "I appreciate that," he said. She hesitated before asking, "Does it feel different now, after everything?" Turning to look out the window, Morgan watched the ground crew loading luggage into the plane. "Maybe," he said after a moment, "but it's too early to tell if it's real change or just good PR." "Chit." She nodded knowingly and leaned back in her seat. The flight took off without incident, and for the first time in weeks, Morgan allowed himself to relax. The rhythmic hum of the engines and gentle sway of the plane eased the tension in his shoulders. Halfway through the flight attendant returned to check on him. "Everything okay, Mr. Freeman?" Morgan looked up from his book and nodded. "All good, thank you." She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I just wanted to say, what happened to you? It shouldn't have, and I know it's not my place, but I wanted to apologize. I've worked in this industry for years." And her voice trailed off, but the sincerity in her eyes spoke volumes. Morgan offered her a small nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. As she walked away, Morgan leaned back in his seat. The battle for change was far from over, but in that moment, he allowed himself to appreciate the strides already made. This flight, unlike the last, felt lighter, not because the work was done, but because it had begun. Morgan Freeman stood quietly, listening to the executive's clipped words, the faint hum of jet engines filling the tense silence of the room. The conference room overlooked the busy airport runway, where planes taxied in perfect rhythm, a backdrop to the gravity of their conversation. "We've honored the terms of the settlement," the executive repeated, his tone defensive. "The training programs are operational. The complaint system is live. And as you can see, we've adopted the inclusivity measures you requested." Morgan held up a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. His expression was calm, yet resolute, a quiet storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. "Honoring the terms isn't just about checking boxes," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's about creating a culture that reflects those changes. Tell me, what steps have you taken to ensure this isn't just a temporary fix?" The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Another cleared his throat and spoke up. "We've conducted initial evaluations to ensure compliance, and we're monitoring employee behavior." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Monitoring? That's a start. But what happens when the cameras are off and the scrutiny fades? Policies are only as strong as the people enforcing them." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Accountability isn't a one-time event. It's a commitment." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Outside, a plane roared to life, its sound reverberating faintly through the glass walls. Morgan took a deep breath and straightened. "I'm not here to antagonize you," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But I need to know this. Do you truly believe in the changes you've implemented? Or are you doing this because public pressure forced your hand?" The executive who had spoken first opened his mouth as if to respond, but hesitated. Finally, a younger executive seated at the far end of the table broke the silence. "I can't speak for everyone here," she said, her voice measured but sincere. "But I believe these changes are necessary, not just for the company, but for the industry as a whole. What happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone. Ever." Morgan regarded her for a moment, the sincerity in her words evident. He nodded. "Then let's make sure it doesn't." Later that day, as Morgan walked through the terminal, he couldn't help but notice how different the atmosphere felt compared to his experience months ago. Travelers of every background moved through the space with ease, the tension he once felt replaced by a sense of neutrality, even warmth. The banners promoting inclusivity hung prominently, but more importantly, the staff interactions he observed seemed genuine, not forced. Approaching a window overlooking the tarmac, Morgan paused to watch a plane ascend into the sky. He thought about the older couple who had thanked him earlier, about the young mother in the crowd with her boarding pass, and about the countless others who might never have to face what he did. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his lawyer. "FAA just confirmed they're adopting similar policies for all domestic carriers. Progress." Morgan smiled faintly and slipped the phone back into his jacket. Progress, indeed. Weeks later, Morgan stood in yet another press room, this time addressing a panel of government officials and industry leaders. The Freeman Foundation had successfully lobbied for the creation of an independent oversight board for airline practices, and today marked the official announcement. As he approached the podium, the audience fell silent. Morgan adjusted the microphone and began to speak, his voice steady and commanding. "Today is about more than policies or procedures," he said. "It's about recognizing that fairness and dignity aren't privileges. They're rights. The steps we've taken are significant, but the journey is far from over. This is a call to action for everyone in this room and beyond, to ensure that our skies are truly equal for all who travel under them." Applause filled the room, but Morgan didn't linger to soak it in. He stepped back, nodding to the officials seated behind him, and walked off the stage. For Morgan, the fight was never about recognition. It was about ensuring that no one, regardless of who they were or where they came from, would ever feel like they didn't belong. And though the road ahead was long, he was ready to keep walking it. Later that evening, Morgan sat in his office, the city skyline twinkling through the windows. His assistant knocked lightly before stepping inside. "Sir, another message came in from the Freeman Foundation website. A family shared their story about flying for the first time without any issues. They wanted to thank you." Morgan leaned back in his chair, letting the words sink in. "Send them a response," he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "And remind them, it's not just me. This fight belongs to all of us." As his assistant left, Morgan turned his gaze back to the city lights. For the first time in a long while, he felt a deep, unshakable sense of hope, not just for the skies, but for the world below. Morgan Freeman placed his hands firmly on the polished table, his voice steady but resolute. "That's not why we're here," he said, cutting through the executive's thinly veiled defensiveness. The man across the table frowned. "Then why are we here?" Morgan leaned forward, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "Because I want to make sure this isn't just a temporary fix. Policies are only as effective as the people enforcing them. What happens 6 months from now when the media stops watching? What happens when this stops trending?" The executives exchanged uneasy glances, their silence a tacit admission that Morgan's concerns weren't unfounded. "You're asking for guarantees we can't make," one of them finally said, his tone cautious. "No," Morgan replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm asking for commitment. Commitment to do more than tick off checkboxes. Commitment to making this permanent." The room went silent, the weight of Morgan's words hanging in the air. Finally, the CEO spoke, his tone measured but cautious. "What do you want?" Morgan's answer was immediate and precise. "Accountability. Real accountability. I want regular audits, public transparency, and a permanent advisory board. And not just any board. I want it to include people like me, people who have experienced this discrimination firsthand." The CEO hesitated, the tension in the room palpable. Then, with a slow nod, he said, "We'll draft the paperwork." 2 weeks later, Morgan boarded another flight. This time, it wasn't a test or a publicity stunt. It was a personal trip, a quiet journey to visit family. He wanted to see for himself if the changes were genuine or merely performative. From the moment he stepped into the terminal, the difference was evident. The staff greeted him with professionalism, not suspicion. The security checks were smooth and efficient, devoid of the accusatory undertones he had grown accustomed to. Even the first-class lounge offered a more welcoming atmosphere. But Morgan wasn't just paying attention to his own experience. He observed the treatment of others. An older black man in a sharp suit was greeted warmly by staff. An interracial couple moved through the priority line without so much as a second glance. When staff dealt with complaints, they did so calmly, respectfully, and without condescension. When Morgan finally took his seat on the plane, a flight attendant approached him with a warm smile. "Mr. Freeman," she said, her tone genuine. "It's an honor to have you fly with us, and I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done." Morgan returned the smile, nodding. "Thank you," he said simply. As the plane ascended into the sky, Morgan gazed out the window, watching the city shrink below. The fight for change wasn't over. He knew how fragile progress could be, but in that moment, he allowed himself to feel a rare and welcome emotion: hope. Weeks later, Morgan returned to the airport. This time, he wasn't there to fly. He was there for the unveiling of a plaque, a permanent tribute to the fight for equality in the skies. Installed near the entrance to the first-class lounge, the plaque served as both a reminder of the challenges faced and a testament to the progress made. Standing before the polished metal, Morgan read the inscription, "Dedicated to those who fought for dignity and equality in the skies. May we always strive to rise above." Lost in thought, Morgan was interrupted by a soft voice behind him. "Mr. Freeman." Turning, he saw the young black woman from the press conference, the one with the child. She was alone this time, her child asleep in a stroller. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Because of you, I don't have to worry about what will happen the next time I fly, and neither does my son." Morgan nodded, his voice quiet yet firm. "That's why we do this." The woman smiled warmly before walking away, leaving Morgan alone once more. He reached out and touched the plaque, his fingers tracing the engraved words. As he stepped back and looked around the bustling terminal, Morgan allowed himself a rare smile. The fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done. But today, they had won a significant victory. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more thought-provoking content. Share this video with your friends and family to spark meaningful conversations. Check out other stories on our channel for more inspiring and impactful narratives.